Good afternoon, good evening. I'm so glad to see you guys. Tonight we have Jeff Thomas. He's one of our favorite presenters. He's a local history teacher, and when school is out for the summer, he becomes a Great Lakes sailor. And tonight his topic is Lost on Lake Huron. Jeff, you can take it from here.
One of your favorites. Wow, I got promoted since last month. Yeah. All right. So, and yeah, that whole becoming a sailor in the summertime. I don't know if I'm jinxing myself here. Here I'm talking about a boat that doesn't float. In about 2 weeks, I'm going to go on one. I hope it's still floating. So I don't know. Maybe this might not be good planning on my part. So I have to be honest about tonight's presentation. I'm a little scatterbrained. It is finals week at Alpena High School, and all the stress that goes along with that for us teachers. And on top of that, I went home last night to rehearse this. It's been about 2 years since I've given this show. And I always type up notes for all of my presentations so I can practice it. And wouldn't you know, my notes for this one weren't saved. They no longer exist. So I am shooting straight from the hip on this one. But I do remember how it starts in the beginning. All the way back in 1906, we're going to see what's going to become really the standard Great Lakes freighter design for several decades in the early 20th century, with the Daniel J. Morrell being launched in, of all places, Bay City, Michigan. A lot of people don't realize that Bay City was a huge shipbuilding port for a number of decades, all the way up into the modern era. We call this design the standard 600-foot design. And this was, the joke was that the shipyards built the ships by the mile, and then they just cut them off to the length the owners wanted. They were all kind of cookie cutter in the same basic design. And so the Morrell is going to be launched on August 22nd of 1906 in Bay City at 602 feet long. And she just missed making history by 4 days. She would have been the longest ship on the Great Lakes. She would have been the new Queen of the Lakes, except that 4 days prior, her sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, was launched in Superior, Wisconsin. And the Townsend beat her by about 2 feet. They used the same plans, and yet somehow the ships built in Wisconsin wound up to be 2 feet longer. And no one's figured out why. So on August 22nd, the Morrell is launched. And here's just a little Google Maps for you here. If you're ever in Bay City, just to the south of the state park, there is now what's now a marina. That used to be one of the major hubs of shipbuilding on the upper lakes. And so that is where the Morrell splashes into fresh water for the first time. And like I said, just a couple days prior to her launching, the Townsend is launched up in Superior. And so the Morrell is never the longest ship on the Great Lakes. She misses that by 4 days. But I want you to remember the name Edward Y. Townsend. These are two vessels. Yes, they are sister ships. And in more than just design, you're going to hear her name over and over again in this story. The parallels between these two vessels is really kind of eerie. In 1909, the Morrell has an accident up in Whitefish Bay. She's steaming upbound and through fog, and manages to run into the Henry Phipps, who is her true sister ship. Built from the same plans, built in Bay City, the same size, and they run into each other in the fog out in Whitefish Bay. And I simply liked the article that describes the accident. Neither ship sank. They both survived the collision. Obviously, there was damage. They had to go to the shipyard. And the Sioux Evening News described the hole in the Morrell as being big enough to drive a team of horses through. So even in 1909, we are still measuring the size of the damage to a ship by how many horses can walk through the hole. Interestingly, just a few months prior to this, in April of 1909, the Edward Y. Townsend was in a collision in Whitefish Bay while upbound in the fog. Parallel number one. The Morrell has her own special place in history besides just the story of her loss. In 1922, she actually becomes the very first bulk carrier on the Great Lakes to carry a gyro compass. Now, a gyro compass was actually created for World War II. Excuse me, not World War I. Getting my dates wrong. That's good for a history teacher right there. I'm confusing my world wars. Told you, it's been a long week. Was created during World War I, and it was a big improvement for Great Lakes freighters because when you get up onto Lake Superior, as we all know, you are surrounded by iron ore deposits, and the traditional magnetic compass is not accurate on Lake Superior. Your compass can be telling you you're going one way when in fact you are going another. And so the gyro compass came up with a series of magnets that will offset the pull of the iron ore deposits, making navigation much safer. And her original gyro compass can be seen today in Washington, D.C. It is in the Smithsonian. So a part of her is on public display in the nation's capital. In the 1930s, she has a modern pilot house and forward cabins installed. So you can kind of see how her look changes a little bit here with these pictures. And by 1956, her old-fashioned triple expansion steam engine is replaced with a 3,200 horsepower Skinner Uniflow engine. And so by 1956, that's what she looks like right there. Modern cabins, twice the horsepower that she was built with, and she is in every way a modern Great Lakes freighter in the middle of the 20th century. Then she has a little bit of bad luck. So all three of these vessels are owned by the Bethlehem Steamship Company. And the Morrell and the Townsend are the two vessels on the bottom here. They were supposed to be done for the season. The ship on the top is the Bethlehem, and she has a breakdown. Something went wrong with her engine, and she was out of commission for the last couple months of the 1966 season. And the company had not reached their required tonnage amounts to meet their contracts. So the office calls the captains of the Townsend and the Morrell and said, you need to go back for one more trip. That always dreaded one final run. The Bethlehem was supposed to take one of these trips and she couldn't. So these two boats are going to make up the difference. A lot of grumbling by the crew, of course, because they were looking forward to going home. And unfortunately, they're going to have to keep working for another week or so. On November 26th of 1966 is where her final story begins. She is unloading in Lackawanna, New York. And when she arrives also with the Townsend, and they're there to unload. And this is before self-unloaders became a big part of Great Lakes shipping. They were in existence, but these two vessels were what we call straight deckers. So they had to be unloaded by shoreside equipment. And so the unloading process was much longer. And so there's two guys on board the Morrell that say, you know, we have time, we can actually get home and go see our families and come back and meet the boat. Because they were 3 or 4 ships deep in line to unload. They weren't even to the dock yet, or at least to the dock where they unloaded. So they had plenty of time. And those guys were Dennis Hale and John Grow. And so they're going to get in Dennis's car and they're going to go home. Best laid plans never work. They go visit their families, they get in the car, they drive back to Lackawanna just in time to see the Daniel J. Morrell sailing past the breakwater. This is a problem for sailors because this is the last trip of the year. And if you lay the boat up for winter, you get a bonus. If they're not on board for this last trip, they are going to be out some serious money. They run to the Coast Guard station. They let them use their radio. They call the captain and the captain says, we have to stop at Windsor, Ontario for fuel. If you can meet us there, fine. If you're not there, oh well. So as the Morrell is steaming across Lake Erie, these two guys are following it in their car, buzzing around the lake to beat it to Detroit. And they get to Detroit, they cross over into Windsor, they get to the dock, and the weather is too rough and the Morrell can't come in. So they spend a night sleeping on a bus stop bench, waiting for their ship to come in. It finally arrives at something like 2 a.m, and they're able to go on board, and they save their last trip, and they're going to get their end of the season bonus. After they take on fuel, the Morrell is also traveling with the Townsend. Again, they're traveling in tandem, and they end up leapfrogging each other up the Detroit River. The weather's getting bad. A storm is kicking up. And so one goes to anchor, the other keeps going and needs to anchor. Then the other boat decides to get going again. And they call some captains that are coming down the lake, and they're paying attention to the weather. They do anchor for a while, and they decide that they can finally head out into Lake Huron and keep going. So after all this, on November 28th, the Daniel J. Morrell and the Edward Y. Townsend are traveling up Lake Huron. They're traveling up the thumb of Michigan. And wouldn't you know it, the weatherman was wrong, because he never is, right? Caught them all by surprise. And all of a sudden, instead of what they thought they were going to be facing, they are facing gale force winds and 20-foot seas. The Morrell is in the lead. These two ships are traveling together, and the captains are talking with each other. And they're at one point, Captain Connolly of the Townsend is calling Captain Crawley, I'm trying to keep those names straight all night, of the Morrell to ask him how things are going. And he says, I got my hands full, I got to call you back. And he hangs up. Well, it turns out that the Townsend was trying to actually blow around sideways into the trough of the waves. The storm is really starting to give them some problems as far as keeping their heading. And of course, if you get caught in the trough of the waves, you could capsize the vessel. That's a very dangerous place to be. So these captains are up against it to keep their ships heading into the storm. And they start talking to each other again. What should we do? Well, should we turn around and go back to Port Huron? Well, good luck turning around in that storm and then trying to navigate into the St. Clair River in those conditions. They thought about possibly coming up by us and turning into Thunder Bay here and anchoring here for some shelter. And there's a downbound captain of the Benson Ford overhears the radio conversation, and he chimes in and says, yep, you could make it in there. Just went by there and should be okay. He wasn't having too much trouble in the storm, but he was loaded. The Benson Ford was loaded with iron ore, and so he was traveling much smoother than the empty Morrell and Townsend were. And so they're really having a rough go of it. To give you an idea of what this storm is doing, this is a passenger ship called the Aquarama, and it was moored in Muskegon, and this storm actually snapped its mooring lines, and the ship got blown around sideways in the harbor. In Ludington, this is still the time period of the railroad car ferries. The city of Midland 41 missed the piers and wound up going on a sandbar. Was not able to get into Ludington. No one was hurt in this particular grounding. In fact, the ship was perfectly fine. They still had heat, they still had food. So the crew and passengers spent a couple days sitting there eating good food and playing cards. And at one point they called in and said, we're running out of food, and the Coast Guard brought them more groceries. And then when the storm was over, they came and pulled them off the sandbar and they got in. But the storm was really causing some problems. On Lake Huron, where the Daniel J. Morrell is fighting the storm, is this little guy, the Howard L. Shaw. And he has quite a story. He's also upbound on the lake in this storm. And at one moment, he's going north, he hits a wave, and is going south. That wave completely turned the Howard L. Shaw around. In the captain's words, spun it around like a top. And he tried twice to turn the ship around and go back north, and he didn't have the power in his engines to do it. And so he wound up going back to Port Huron, whether he liked it or not. The storm said, you are going south right now. I will let you know when you can turn around, and it's not right now. So this is not an average storm. This is obviously one that is giving many vessels some problems. So the Daniel J. Morrell is upbound in this storm, as I said, and Dennis Hale, one of the guys that chased it across Lake Erie with the car, he's asleep. He is up in the bow section. If you can kind of see those portholes there right above the name on the front of the ship, one of those would have been his room. He's done working for the day, so he's in his bunk asleep. Well, he's trying to sleep, but when you have a cabin at the front of the ship in a storm, there's all sorts of noises, rattling anchor chains. The anchors can sometimes thump against the steel plates. I use the term sleep loosely. But he's trying to sleep through all this, and all of a sudden he hears a very loud thud, and he thinks it's the anchor, and he just kind of rolls over and ignores it. You learn to ignore a lot of strange noises on board a ship. And then he hears it again, and all the books, he had a bookshelf above his bunk, and all the books fell out on his head. And he realizes that, if it's going to get this nasty, maybe I might as well get up. There's no sleeping through this anyway. So he reaches over to the light switch and flips the light switch, and nothing turns on. About the time he thinks, uh-oh, the general alarm goes off. And so he grabs a life jacket, runs out into the hallway, and Albert Weem, one of his shipmates, is running by. And so they run down the corridor and out onto deck, and Albert looks out through the hatchway and he yells, "Oh my God," turns around, runs right back into his room. Poor Dennis is standing there going, "That's not good." He looks out on deck, and what he sees is something he never thought he would actually ever see. Right about here, where this arrow is on the Morrell, right around the number 10 hatch, he watches the ship starting to crack. The ship is splitting itself in two. And so Dennis realizes we're in trouble. He runs back to his cabin to try to get more clothes on, because remember, he was sleeping. The lights aren't working, because when the ship first cracked, it severed the power lines. The generators are in the back of the ship. So when it first cracked, it cut all the power to the bow section. And so the lights weren't working. And so he's fumbling around in his dark cabin trying to find clothes. All he can find is his pea coat, his wool pea coat, and he actually puts it on over his life jacket. He can't find any pants, socks, or shoes. So he's out there now in his boxer shorts, life jacket, and pea coat, and bare feet in November in a storm. Yes, very cold. I'm sure he couldn't feel his feet for very long, but that's all he had time to find in the dark. And of course, he realizes what's happening to the ship. He doesn't want to stay below deck very long. He's in a hurry to get back out. So the forward end crew is gathered out on deck, and kind of here by this blue arrow, if you kind of see those two little dots, that's where the life raft is on the Morrell. It's a pontoon style life raft. And all the guys are waiting to figure out what to do. And there's one guy there among them they all look to. His name is Norman Bragg. And I didn't tell you about him last month, but he was in last month's story about the Henry Steinbrenner. Norman Bragg survived that sinking. And so all the guys on the Morrell look at him and go, "Well, Norm, you've been through this before. What do we do?" And in typical laconic sailor fashion, he says, "Well, boys, we better get on the life raft." Sounds like good advice, I think. So they get on the life raft. Everyone is there, and they're watching this ship just tear itself apart. The steam lines are ripping apart. So steam is shooting up into the air. The sparks are flying. And Dennis describes it as just a scene almost from a horror movie. He said it almost looked like a headless dragon. When the ship finally splits in two, they can actually look into the cargo hold of the stern section. And the interior lights were still burning, because that's where the generators are. So the stern section still had lights, and it starts coming right for them. And it actually runs into the bow half 3 times and shoves the bow half out of the way. And so the life raft gets thrown off during the sinking. One thing that Dennis does remember from right before he got washed overboard is one of the oilers, one of the guys that worked in the engine room. It was his job to oil all the bearings and everything and all the equipment. He's standing out on deck watching this with his oil can in his hand. And Dennis said he didn't go anywhere. He just stood there, like he couldn't really register what he was seeing. So he just stood there with his oil can in his hand. Apparently the guys in the stern realized something must be wrong, so they sent him up to go check it out, and he just kind of stood there and wasn't sure how to handle this situation. Eventually the raft gets washed off into the sea because the bow section sinks. The stern section does not immediately. And so what I have here, I have another map first. So when the bow section sinks, all these guys are thrown into the water. 4 of them make it back to the life raft. Only 4. So what happens is it splits. These guys are thrown in the water, and as they're watching, he watches the bow section tip straight up and just sink to the bottom. But what he also watches when the bow sinks, here's a picture of this isn't the exact life raft that they were on, but it's an exact duplicate. This is the standard life raft of the era. So this is exactly what they would have been on, just not this exact one. So when the bow section sinks, the stern section sails off into the night, half a ship. Lights still blazing, propeller still turning. And Dennis says they sat on the raft. They could see guys out on deck. They're trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to get off of this half a boat. But again, that's where the engine is. So everything was still running. And when the bow section broke off, if you think about it, all the weight is in the very back of the boat. So that stern section tipped up like this. And so the waves couldn't just immediately wash into that open cargo hold. And so they watch the stern section sail away. And I had the privilege, actually twice, I got to sit and talk with Dennis Hale. And he told me one time they were on the raft and they're watching this, and he looks over at one of the other guys, and in the middle of this life raft, there's a storage locker and there's a flashlight in there. And this guy had dug in there and gotten the flashlight, and he'd flicked it on, and he was waving the flashlight. He said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, there's lights over there. I'm trying to signal that boat." Dennis looks and they're watching. He goes, "It's the stern half of our boat." It was still floating. It had been enough time that this guy thought it was another vessel, and he was trying to signal it for help. And Dennis finally realized, no, it's the stern section of our ship. It's still up. And you might want to turn the flashlight off and save the batteries. They're not coming back for us. Interestingly, I can't show you exactly what it looked like, but I can get pretty close. If you've been to any of my shows before, many people have commented that I find really cool pictures. I'm not disappointing tonight. There was another ship that was built from the same plans as the Daniel J. Morrell called the Michipicoten. And when it was being towed for scrap, the pictures I'm about to show you, no one was on board, no one was hurt. Okay, it was an empty ship, but it splits in half and it sinks. And someone on the tug that was towing it had the presence of mind to grab a camera. So you can see it here just starting to crack in about the same place as the Morrell. You can see this about a 20-foot wave she's nosing into here. Here she's just about completely split in half. Here's the two halves completely separated now. You can kind of see looking into that empty cargo hold. And then the bow section starts to plunge. And according to Dennis's testimony, that was the last sight he saw right there of his ship, the Daniel J. Morrell, was the bow section tipped straight up vertical and diving for the bottom of Lake Huron. Again, someone had the presence of mind to grab a camera, just like the rescue from the boat last month, right? I love it when someone back then had a camera on board. There are some really cool pictures out there. And then, as if things weren't bad enough for the 4 men left on the life raft, what happens around them, the story that's going on both on the lake and on shore is really disastrous. I don't really know if I have a word to describe exactly how bad I feel for these four guys. And I'll show you what I mean. Here's a timeline. On November 29th at 12:15 a.m., just past midnight, is the last time that the Edward Y. Townsend talks with a Daniel J. Morrell. Captain Connolly makes radio contact with Arthur Crawley on the Morrell, and they sign off. No major problems were discussed. They were still basically hanging in there in the storm. They had their hands full, but neither guy thought that they were not going to survive the storm by any means. So that's 12:15 in the morning of the 29th. At 1:45 and 3:45 a.m., the Townsend tries to contact the Morrell again and is unable to. Now, there's a lot of reasons why you can't make radio contact in a storm. You have a lot of interference. Perhaps a large wave or something else has taken out a ship's radio antenna. Not something that would necessarily spark panic on the part of Captain Connolly. At 9 a.m., Bethlehem Steel Company required all of their vessels to check in at certain times with the company office via radio. And at 9 a.m., the Morrell missed their regularly scheduled radio call. The dispatcher did not hear from the Morrell. So he's wondering about that, but again, there's lots of reasons why. So at 2 p.m., he has tried to make contact with the Morrell after 9 a.m. unsuccessfully. He contacts the vessel, the Arthur B. Homer. Irony of ironies, the Arthur B. Homer is the sister ship of the Edmund Fitzgerald. As long as we're talking about ships lost in a storm, why not add that piece of trivia? And he asked the Homer to try to make contact because he thinks maybe with the weather conditions, the signal's just not traveling far enough. You're in that area. Can you contact him? The Homer calls back and says negative, getting no response. Fast forward to the next day, November 30th. In the morning, the Edward Y. Townsend, the ship that was behind the Morrell, they remember they're traveling together, and the Townsend is behind the Morrell. The Townsend arrives at the Lime Island fueling station in the St. Mary's River. He has traversed the entire length of Lake Huron. And at that point in time, there was a coal dock on Lime Island. So ships would stop there for fuel. These ships were still powered by coal. And he calls the company and says, the Morrell's not here. He was ahead of us. He's not here. And he hasn't been here. He hasn't fueled and left. No one has seen him. So there are multiple problems here. The Morrell should have beaten the Townsend to Lime Island and did not. They can't raise it by radio. And none of the marine observing companies at this time period, there are still companies, it's their job to be boat nerds. It is their job to watch for ships. And when they see one go by, they send a telegram or they call that ship's home office and say, hey, we saw this ship at this place at this time, all is well. None of them saw the Morrell either. That's three ways they could have located the missing Morrell and did not. Captain Connolly on the Townsend has further bad news. He says, by the way, boss, we're not going anywhere. We have a large crack on our deck at the number 10 hatch, and we have a lot of rivets in our hull that are loose. We are staying right here. Finally, at 12:15 p.m. on the 30th, Art Dobson, the dispatcher for Bethlehem Steel, calls the Coast Guard to report the Morrell missing. Amazingly, that is 34 hours after the ship went down. It is 34 hours before the Coast Guard is even made aware that there's a missing vessel. Well, let's back up for a minute. That's what's happening on shore. What's happening to the four guys on the life raft? I told you 4 men made it to that raft after it got dumped in the water. Dennis Hale, Art Stojak, John Cleary, and Charles Fossbender. affectionately known as Fuzzy. They make it to the raft, and so it's going to be the 4 of them. I told you the story about Fuzzy grabbing the flashlight and trying to signal the stern of the Morrell, and Dennis says, "Don't do that. That's not a rescue ship." By the morning of the 29th, only Hale and Fassbender are left alive. The other 2 men have frozen to death in the night. They can see land, but they're too frozen. The raft does have oars, but after basically all night on an open raft, they're too frozen. They can't use them. They can't row. But it looks like the wind and the waves are pushing them towards shore. They're just trying to hang on there. And then comes probably the most heartbreaking part of this story. As they're getting closer to shore, Fuzzy looks up and he tells Dennis he can see the shore, but that his chest feels heavy. It feels like his lungs are filling up. And Dennis asks, "So can you cough it out?" And Fuzzy tries to cough that water out of his lungs, and he passes away. He collapses right there. And that stuck with Dennis the rest of his life. Did I give my shipmate advice that was that bad? So now it's only Dennis Hale left alive on the raft. Just at dark. So they've spent he has now spent an entire day on this open life raft, runs aground in shallow waters close to shore. He can actually see a farmhouse in the distance and the lights are on. Somebody is home. He tries to shout, but he's just too worn out, too frozen. He fires off. He does have a flare gun that's stored on the life raft. He fired one almost immediately after they got on the raft, just in case there was a ship nearby that could see it. And the thing broke in 2 in his hands. So he actually fires his last flare by holding the gun together with both hands. And he said he was grateful for that because the heat of the flare going through the barrel warmed his hands up a little bit. But he can't get anyone to hear him or see the flare. And he is at shore, but he's too weak to wade the extra 20 feet to dry ground. And he can't get anyone in that house to notice that he's there. Like I said, he's shouting, he's firing his last flare. He's trying desperately to get anyone to notice him. And one thing he had been doing all night is, of course, if there's a benefit to being a shipwreck survivor on the Great Lakes, you are surrounded by fresh water. Okay, guys that are shipwrecked on the ocean, they can't drink the water. He can at least. And the flare gun had a lanyard, and he was dipping it in the water between the slats of the raft, and he was kind of squeezing the water out of that lanyard. Well, he lost the lanyard, and he's getting very, very thirsty. And so he starts to pick the ice off of his pea coat, and he starts to eat the ice because he's so thirsty. And then he tells a story that I'm just going to leave up to your imagination for a moment. But he says that he just had a feeling somebody was watching him. He couldn't explain it. And he turned around, and there was a guy looking at him. And I don't know exactly why, but just the way that Dennis describes this guy, I think Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, okay? He says the guy was in a long robe, he had a long white beard, bushy white eyebrows. And he said, he just looked friendly. So I called him Doc. And he said this guy told him, "Don't eat the ice on your pea coat." So he stopped, and Doc disappeared. After a little bit, he starts getting thirsty again, so he starts eating the ice a second time. And he says, Doc appeared a second time, and this time he was mad at me. And he said he pointed his finger at me and said, "Stop eating the ice. It will lower your body temperature and you will die." He never sees Doc again. He does talk about having an out-of-body experience where he rejoined the Morrell. He saw his shipmates, and he's not really sure what's going on. He just knows what he is seeing and hearing, but he never sees Doc after the second time. So that's where Dennis is. He's on a raft 20, 30 feet from shore, waiting to be rescued before he gives in to the elements, basically. and this article is slightly wrong. The official report actually lists this as 12:12. So I'm guessing somebody at the news office missed a key on the typewriter. But at about 12:12 p.m. on Wednesday, this vessel, the GG Post, was sailing past the Thumb of Michigan and locates a body with a life jacket stenciled DJ Morrell. 12:12 p.m. they picked that up. 12:15 p.m. the Coast Guard is notified the Morrell is missing. At almost the exact same moment. And obviously they radio the Coast Guard immediately and tell them what they have found. And now the Coast Guard is aware and the whole region is aware that there is a Great Lakes freighter missing. And there are 29 missing. She carried a crew of 29. Within 2 hours of the search and rescue operations beginning, the Coast Guard locates Dennis Hale. So they're flying around in a helicopter and they find the life raft and they radio in that there are 4 bodies on board and they believe that all 4 are lost. And the pilots are circling around and they're reporting this in, and Dennis picks his arm up and waves. If I was the pilot, I would have crashed. But so they land right next to the raft, and a couple guys jump out and come grab Dennis off the raft. And he said all he could do was just keep yelling, "I love you, I love you." They said that helicopter was the greatest thing he'd ever seen in his life. And so they grab Dennis, they put him in the helicopter, and they fly him to the Harbor Beach Hospital, where at this point, obviously, the story's already made the news. All the media reporters are waiting for him. The guy has just survived 36 hours on a life raft in November. He's not in a condition to talk. And we all know how news reporters love to leave people alone. So they hide Dennis Hale in the maternity ward. But they couldn't get at him there. He was allowed to kind of recuperate. And really his story at that point gets even crazier. He talks about his doctor, Dr. Oakes, actually called the Henry Ford Hospital because he had never dealt with a hypothermia case this bad. So he calls Henry Ford and says, "What do I do? You know, what do I look for?" And they kind of walked him through what to look for and what to be careful of. And Dr. Oakes says, just out of curiosity, at what temperature will his heart stop? And they said, well, about 94, 95 degrees, his heart will stop. Dr. Oakes says, well, his temperature is 92 and he's talking. So apparently this is one tough guy. Of course, his wife is brought in to go meet him at the hospital. He's a practicing Catholic, so he asked to get a visit from a priest. And so the local priest comes to visit him. And the first thing the priest does is give Dennis the last rites. Poor Dennis is laying in his bed going, what didn't they tell me? I thought I survived this. What? Hey, doc, why is this guy giving me the last rites all of a sudden? Fortunately, he didn't need them. He did survive, but I just can't even imagine. You survive all that. You ask to see a priest, and the first thing he does is give you the last rites. That had to be just a complete shock. As he actually was in really good shape for what he had been through. He did have some frostbite on his feet, obviously with no socks or shoes. In the end, he had, I think, 2 toes ended up having to be amputated, but he had some bruising and some cracked ribs from a bar on the life raft. But when you think about 36 hours in those conditions, that's pretty minor, really. Not only did the news media want to talk to him, but so does the Coast Guard, because they want to know why the Morrell went down. And what better place to start than the survivor? So they come visit him in the hospital. And the Coast Guard officer asks him, says, so when you were abandoning ship, did you think to grab your sailing papers? Exactly what I'm going to think to grab if that general alarm goes off at some point. Yeah. Dennis says, no, I didn't. Are you aware of what I was wearing when they found me? And the officer says, yes, yes, I am. So Dennis says, where do you think I put them? At which point the interview was concluded. After you've been through all that, you might as well tell off the Coast Guard. I mean, why not? So as Dennis is recovering in the hospital, more bodies are being found. And they're being found in groups of 2 or 3. They're being found singly. The life raft from the stern section is actually found. And one guy was wedged in between the pontoons. And no one has ever come up with an idea of how that happened, how he got wedged between the life raft. And so, but they will find everybody from the Morrell eventually. And you can see here, the X is roughly, on that map is roughly where the Morrell sinks. And you can see where the bodies are being picked up. The weather is pushing them further south. And so the Coast Guard really was not happy to be notified 34 hours after the fact. They said, we could have helped had you told us. Like, we would much rather go out and find a ship with a broken antenna than go out later and pick up bodies. So the Coast Guard was really not happy with the late start that they got, because these guys take pride in going and rescuing people. And if they're not able to because you didn't tell them to go look, they take that very personally. Lake Huron, in a strange twist of fate, almost seemed angry that Dennis Hale cheated her. So the GG Post, the freighter that picked up the first victim of the Morrell, when she makes the dock in the Saginaw River, the second cook slipped and fell off the boarding ladder and was lost. Lake Huron wanted the full 29. Then the story really starts to come out about all the efforts that were made to contact the Morrell, how long they had known that they couldn't talk to it, that something may have been wrong. And it really bothers one man. This is the Coast Guard cutter Acacia. And she's a museum ship in Manistee now, but on that particular night, she was upbound on Lake Huron. And Captain Charles Milrat was in command of her. And for a local tie, why was she in the area? She was responding to the SOS from the 8 guys still on the Nordmere. When the Nordmere went aground just off of Alpena here, 8 guys stayed on board to protect it from salvagers, because at that point they thought they could still salvage the ship and the cargo. And then this storm came up and started breaking the Nordmere up, so they issued a mayday call saying, come get us. And so he was on his way to go respond to the Nordmere's mayday call. And come to find out, he was only about 20 miles away from the Morrell when she sank. And he never knew it, because the Morrell was never able to get a mayday call off. Like I said, when the ship first cracked, it broke the power line, so the radios all went dead. They were not able to issue a mayday call. But he was only 20 miles away with his cutter. And who knows? In those conditions, you just never know what may have happened, but at least someone would have been looking, and there was a chance help could have been given. Not all shipwreck stories have nothing but bad news. And I always like to try to find one good story. This is Patricia Haley. She's a 13-year-old girl in the Port Huron area. And this is her dad, Claire Haley. Patricia has not seen her dad in years. Her parents divorced. He was a sailor, didn't know where he was. And then his name turned up on the list of the lost of the Morrell. Only to find out that he had left the Morrell just a couple weeks before it sank. And so she gets news of that. It was reported, because they're always updating the list of the lost, right? When they start figuring out if someone may have gone off on vacation or gone home for some other reason, they update that list. And she reads in the paper, the Port Huron Times Herald, that no, my dad was not lost when the ship sank. He had left the Morrell. And so she walks into the newspaper office of the Port Huron Times-Herald, and she says, "Can you help me find my dad?" And they did. They started running newspaper articles. They sent it to other newspapers, not just in Michigan, but around the Great Lakes region. There were TV articles about this. TV reporters came and talked to her. And basically they put out this region-wide call for Claire Haley to please call his daughter. And he saw it. He was in Duluth, Minnesota. And he saw it on the nightly news, and he said, "I couldn't get to the phone fast enough." So the sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell at least reunited one dad with his daughter that he hadn't seen in years. There's always one heartwarming story somewhere if you dig deep enough. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know if they stayed in contact or, it just faded out of the news after that. But at least for a little bit, Patricia found her dad. There's another guy that sort of survived the Morrell sinking. This is Jalmer Edwards. He's the second cook on the Morrell. And never has a man been more thankful for catching pneumonia. They were downbound, loaded on their way to Lackawanna with their last load before their final trip up. And he caught pneumonia, and it got so bad that when they locked through at Sault Ste. Marie, they put him ashore and took him to War Memorial Hospital in the Sioux. So he was not on board when the ship sank. But can you imagine being in the hospital recovering from pneumonia, and you get the news that your ship and 28 of your crewmates are gone? He describes the ship as being a good ship. It was in good condition. The crew was a good group of guys, good morale. But then the Coast Guard starts investigating. They've already talked to Dennis Hale. They already know the basic story of what happened. But the Coast Guard wants to know more than the basic story. They want to know why. They want to know, why is this ship on the bottom? The first thing they're going to do is go visit the one that was traveling with it. They're going to go investigate on the Townsend. They're going to go look at that cracked deck and the loose rivets. And they don't like what they see. In fact, they actually pull the ship's safety certificate. They will not allow that ship to travel again with crew on board. It needs to go to a shipyard, and it will be towed as an empty ship. When the Coast Guard goes and investigates, it turns out the damage is much more extensive than Captain Connolly even knew. More rivets are loose. Some are missing. The crack actually extends further across the deck than he knew. The Edward Y. Townsend was this close to breaking in half and sinking right next to her sister ship. The Coast Guard is going to go looking for the wreck. They want to see the Morrell. They want to see the evidence on the bottom. And in 1966, that's kind of a possible thing to do, even in deep water. And it doesn't take them long to pinpoint the stern section. They find the stern section, and they do put divers down. They do bring up some of the hull plates. They do some testing on it. They never find the bow section. They only find half of it. They do mark where the stern is located. They put a big metal buoy right over top of it, and the buoy promptly sank. And they went back out to go find it again, and the buoy was gone. And that's what they find on the bottom. And you can see in this drawing, one of the lifeboats is still there. And it looks like you could just pick it up and float it away, except the front half is gone. What they come up with, what the investigation figures out. Well, first off, you have to go through all the testimony, and people are back and forth. Was the ship a rust bucket, or was it in good shape? Some people say that it was in good shape. The Coast Guard says it passed their inspection. Turns out one crewman, right before it was lost, had written a letter home and said that they had blown 2 more tubes in its boiler and that the thing was just at the end of its life. And remember, at this point, the Daniel J. Morrell was 60 years old. However, that is not unduly old on the Great Lakes. There are many ships out there today that are older than 60, still sailing. It's fresh water, so the steel doesn't deteriorate like it does in salt water. So some people say that it was seaworthy. Some people say that it was a rust bucket. They have to figure out exactly who's right here. Even the storm was argued about. The captain of the Benson Ford that told the two captains that they could find shelter in Thunder Bay said, it really wasn't that bad. Okay, but you're loaded with 30,000 tons of iron ore. They're empty. Remember the Howard L. Shaw, and his captain found himself going 180 degrees the other direction. He said, no, it was pretty bad. It turned me around against my will. So even the ferocity of the storm was argued. What the conclusion about the Morrell finally was. First off, the Coast Guard has a great knack for understatement. High stress due to the height of the waves. Got it. Sort of figured that one. Thanks. But what they also come up with is the steel that ships like the Morrell was built out of was highly susceptible to brittle fracture. Before 1948, steel was made using what's known as the Bessemer process. And that steel, when it gets cold, is known to crack. It becomes brittle. I've never been in water in November anywhere in Michigan and have it not be cold. So I'm pretty sure those hull plates were chilled right down. So that is why they say the Morrell sank, why it broke in half, is that the steel, not that the steel was flawed, just simply it couldn't handle those conditions. In other conditions, it was perfectly fine. It wasn't a problem with the design. It was a problem with the steel making process. For the causes of loss of life, they point to the no distress signals being able to be sent. They definitely hammer Bethlehem Steel Company for the 34-hour delay in telling them to go look for men in the water. And they say, the life-saving equipment, not so good. Open pontoon life rafts in November. Doesn't work, except that was Coast Guard regulation approved at the time. So before the Morrell sank, they were fine with it. But they point to that. And there are a lot of changes that are recommended. They recommend that every vessel carries what's called an EPIRB. It's an acronym, Emergency Position Indicator Radio Beacon. There'll be a test after. What that is, it's a small device. If a ship sinks, this thing breaks free and floats to the surface and immediately starts emitting an emergency beacon. So even if the ship can't issue a mayday call, there is a device that will do it for the men. So they recommend that. They recommend covered life rafts. So there are some recommendations, some valid recommendations that come out of this. But then that leads to the question of, where is the Morrell? Well, we know where it is. It's on the bottom. Just where? We used to know where half of it was till the Coast Guard lost their buoy. And then where's the Townsend? The Townsend is going to sit at the dock in Sault Ste. Marie for a couple of years. It's never going to sail again. And they are going to tow it overseas for scrap. And on her way across the Atlantic Ocean, she breaks in half and sinks in the vicinity of the Titanic. So she's in very deep water somewhere. Then on May 18th of 1979, 13 years almost after the sinking, one shipwreck hunter has a day to remember. David Trotter is by far the premier shipwreck hunter in the Great Lakes. If you're researching a shipwreck, odds are David found it. And in 1979, a new technology known as Loran C was just coming to the Great Lakes, and he was one of the first ones to have that technology on his boat. He wanted to go test it out by finding the stern section of the Morrell. He had a rough idea where it should have been, and wouldn't you know it, Loran C takes him right out to it. Oh, and about 30 feet below the surface, he also found the Coast Guard's missing buoy too. It sank about 30 feet and was floating down there. So I don't know if he gave it back or took it home for a souvenir, and found it right away. So I said, you know what, let's just go east. Let's just go east and see what happens. And wouldn't you know it, he found the missing bow section too. In the same day, both halves 5 miles apart. 5 miles. The stern section sailed on 5 miles in an hour and a half before it finally sank. They're both in fairly deep water, 200 some odd feet. And so in 1979, both halves are located. Just to make more links for you, when the ship sinks, during the investigation of the Townsend, wouldn't you know who's locking through the Sioux locks that day? Setting a single season tonnage record. And Captain Peter Polster even says, yeah, that storm wasn't so fun. And then I showed you this picture earlier. This is Charles Milrat. This is the guy that was commander of the cutter Acacia that was 20 miles from the Morrell when it sank. He will be commander of Group Sioux on November 10th, 1975. He will be in charge of the search and rescue operations for the Edmund Fitzgerald. It will be Charles Milrat who famously asked the Arthur M. Anderson to turn around and go back out and look for the 29 men on the Fitzgerald. So there's just connections all over with this story. Like I said, I had the opportunity to talk with Dennis Hale, the only survivor of the Morrell, twice. He passed away in 2015, I think it was. He was quite a guy. And actually, he never talked about the shipwreck. He did not want to be Dennis Hale, the shipwreck survivor. He wanted to be Dennis Hale, the tool and die maker. He never sailed again after the Morrell, until years later. He got a trip on a modern freighter along with one of the survivors from the Bradley sinking. And the company invited these two men and I think 7 friends maybe, invited them for a cruise. And he said they went aboard and it was really good for him, except the crew wouldn't talk to him. Apparently, they were a little nervous about having 2 shipwreck survivors on their vessel. And he said by the return trip, they realized they weren't bad luck and they were talking to him. But in 79, or excuse me, 80 or 81, it was right after both halves of it were discovered. They made a documentary of the discovery and they premiered it at Lake Superior State College and they invited Dennis to it. And he said, I'll come, but I don't want to speak. And they said, that's fine. That's fine. And they showed the video and Dennis got up to the podium and he started telling the whole story. And I wasn't there. That's a little bit before my time, but I do have a friend who was in college there at that time and was there that night. And he said it was quite the moment. And after that, Dennis found a lot of therapy in talking about what he went through. Like I said, he sat down and talked with me twice. And I've heard a lot of the stories I've shared with you tonight directly from Dennis himself. I add the newspaper articles and stuff, but a lot of what I've told you is straight from the sole survivor himself. And that is the story of the Daniel J. Morrell. I made it without being able to practice. I made it.
The other sister ships, as a result of what you ended up with 3 of these ships that built.
Well, you have the Morrell, you have the Townsend. Yeah, you're talking about the pictures I had, the Michipicoten, she did. Ships breaking in half on the Great Lakes has happened a lot. And what a lot of people don't realize is there are many more that almost did. Even some of the modern ones that have stories. I interviewed a captain one time. There's a ship that's out there now. He was on it in the 80s and he said they started to crack going across Lake Superior in a storm. And they were running mooring cables from the front of the boat to the back to kind of hold it together. So it's a common thing.
Changes in safety.
Well, yes. A lot of the modern ships don't have that problem because after 1948, the steel isn't as susceptible to that brittle fracture. But at the time of the Morrell, what they did is they went back and all those older vessels, they actually added steel to the hull. So they made, they took strips of steel along the sides and they welded it in to strengthen that of the newer steel. So they did do some design, not design changes, but they came up with a way to strengthen the ones that were made of the brittle steel. They are inflatable. So basically what happens if your ship is sinking, you throw the thing overboard, you jump in the lake after it and hope you can swim to it. And then there's more to it than that, but that's the rough basic idea. Yes. Hopefully I never have to experience that firsthand, but yes, they're inflatable. So you get in, you zip the door shut. It's like a floating tent and it will keep you out of, and they're supposed to float free if the ship sinks too. So if it goes down suddenly at a certain depth, they're supposed to pop the latches and they're supposed to just float up on their own. So either way, there should be a raft for people to get to. Most modern freighters now, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them don't even have traditional lifeboats anymore. They just have the inflatable covered life rafts. Yep.
One person?
In the rafts? No, they're usually like about a 20 person. Yep.
Wasn't there a ship being towed in Thunder Bay that sank?
The Nordmere?
No, it was being towed.
I'm not sure what ship. The
I guess I missed.
there, well, okay, you know, there was one that almost sank in Thunder Bay. It was on a scrap. Yeah, I think I know which one you're talking about now. Sometimes you gotta give me a minute, but there was a ship that was being towed to the scrapyard and it started taking on water, and they pulled it into Thunder Bay to fix it up and pump it out, but it wasn't coming here. But it didn't go down, but it was. They had to stop and fix it in a hurry. It's called the Governor Miller. Yeah, I think that's the one you're probably thinking of. Right behind you.
I sailed I sailed in between 70 and 73 on the cement boats and also U.S. steel boats out of calcite. When I was on cement boats, there was an engineer, and he was from previous to sailing on the Great Lakes. He sailed on the ocean freighters, and he said that the storms on the Great Lakes are worse than the ocean because you take a beating because the waves are just, they pound the hell out of you.
Yes. Oh
Where
yeah.
On the ocean, it's the swells and you just ride them.
Yeah. Everyone thinks
Right.
about ships in a storm, you know, going up and down the
Yes.
waves, but you get out, you get
Yeah.
out there and they're coming from every
We've-
direction.
I've been in a couple good ones.
Yeah.
And, one was up on Lake Superior. We were going to lay up the WF White, the U.S. steel boat, out of calcite. And we got caught in a gale storm up there in Lake Superior. And we took refuge behind the Keweenaw Peninsula. And the old man or the captain put us behind the Keweenaw there until the gale wind subsided. Well, we didn't know it, but he started to take it out. We got hit broadside by the wind, by the waves. They're coming over the deck. And when I seen these older guys with the fear in their eyes as big as golf balls, I said, well, I got scared. I said, they've been through more than I have because I was just a kid. And
If they're
but
scared.
once the old man turned it and we went headed towards Duluth, we were hitting with the wind right towards the bow. So we were one of these up like that. So it wasn't broadside to the boat.
But then you get in those, you start seeing that hull twist and bend. gets your
yeah.
attention, doesn't it?
Yeah, it did.
And they do. You can stand on deck and you can watch them.
Oh, yeah.
Do that. The first time you're down below in the tunnel and you watch the door at the other end go into the ceiling, make you question why you're
some
there.
pictures, but yeah, nothing extreme. Going over to Green Bay, this was on a slip. Got in a storm there in Lake Michigan, and one of my roommates or bunkmates, he puts his life jacket on, and so I says to him, I says, he was scared, he was paranoid or whatever, that we were gonna go down. And instead of consoling him, I'm thinking, I said, the only thing that life jacket will do is they'll find your body if we do go down.
Right, yeah.
Because the water.
You won't
is-
drown, you'll freeze.
Right, the hypothermia. As soon as you hit the water in a couple of minutes, you're hypothermia and you're gone. But then after, years later, you're supposed to console them, and here you're telling them.
Sailors don't do that.
Yeah,
That's not what we do.
anyway, yeah, there's just, yeah.
Sailors are a fatalistic lot.
Here in the United States.
Okay, so the question was why did they take the Townsend overseas to scrap it, not scrap it here? A lot of it has to do with price. And the sad reality is overseas, those shipyards don't have all the safety features, all the safety requirements that we do here. And so it just economically works out better for the companies to send them over that way. Now, in that case, like with the Townsend, yes, it broke apart and sank, but nobody was on it. So it's 13,000 feet down, and it still happens. We had a modern freighter do that in 2009. The Algo port was on its way to China for a refit, and it broke apart and sank in the Pacific. Some of it too is ocean waves are different, like we mentioned, and lake freighters are designed for lake waves. And so they're outside of the super carriers that we all see on the news. Usually lake freighters are actually longer than ocean ships. So they get on those long rolling swells and they start bending and flexing more than they're supposed to, and they're just not designed for it. So if they can get across the ocean and not hit weather, they're okay. But if they get into a storm on the ocean, those hulls just aren't designed for that. You have a question?
I have one.
Worked with a guy in the hot riveters. Just a busy guy crossing Lake Superior. Yeah, decided to retire from that job. Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories about the old riveted boats. When they started bending and twisting in the waves, rivets would actually break off and go flying around inside the tunnels. And I'm really glad my boat is welded. That would probably send me ashore in a hurry. You had a
I was
question?
just curious, is that Townsend the same one that used to come into the cement plant? Is it the same ship?
No,
It is not.
it is
Okay.
not. No, that would be the Paul. So the question was the Edward Y. Townsend, the cement boat Townsend that would come in here? No, that was the Paul H. Townsend. Yep. Anybody else? Thanks for coming. Oh, it's my pleasure.
Have a safe summer.
I really hope I